Well, thank you, Felix, for the introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be with you. And first of all, apologies that just due to scheduling difficulties, I couldn't actually be with you in the afternoon, and we had to pre-record this morning. But I still hope that I'll be able to leave you with a clear impression of the sort of impact that climate change and preparing for a more sustainable future is having on my business and the finance business. So thanks to the Green Council for the opportunity to come and talk to you today. If any of us were in any doubt about the gravity of the situation, then I think the IPCC report published just in August dispels all that doubt. It was very clear. It set out the evidence that changes in our climate are the result of human activity, and that temperature rises are already locked in at least to partway through this century. The most striking thing I found in it was that one can think of the world's remaining carbon budget consistent with a 1.5 degree temperature rise as only 400 gigatons of carbon dioxide. And at the current annual emissions rate, we will exhaust that in 10 years' time. So it's clear that there's a real urgency behind action. Now, Asia is particularly impacted. Asia represents more than 50% of the global population and hosts 15 of the 20 global cities most vulnerable to rising sea levels. And we've seen the economic and social impacts of climate change through severe weather events, floods, droughts, etc. in Southeast Asia. So we're very familiar with that. But Asia is also where the biggest financing gap exists for the sustainable infrastructure and the transformation that needs to happen associated with the transition to a low carbon economy. 66 trillion is the estimate that the GFMA have put on that, and that's a lot of money. So Albert Einstein, if I can paraphrase, he said that if anybody is not profoundly disturbed by the implications of quantum mechanics, then they haven't understood it. And I think the same can be said of climate. If anybody isn't concerned about the impact of climate change, then they really haven't understood it. The stakes are high. And of course, we speak just before policymakers will gather at the COP in Glasgow. And really, we hope that they will rise to the challenge this November and make significant progress with new targets and I hope innovative approaches to things like carbon pricing. For Hong Kong, where we're speaking today, we have a particular interest and a role to play. While the territory itself is small, certainly in global terms, we have an outsized contribution to make because we're an international financial centre. And the extent to which we can provide a market for green services and a focal point to fund the transition, then we can be part of the region's story in terms of transition to a low carbon economy and part of mainland China's story. So this is a real opportunity for Hong Kong as well as a sustainability challenge. And we welcome, of course, as speaking on behalf of the finance industry, at all the outreach that we've been receiving from the cross-agency steering group and the plans that they announced in July. And also, of course, the chief executive's plans more generally on climate in her policy address just yesterday. So I'd like to turn now to what it means for the finance industry, just to leave you with a bit of impression about the trends that are going on there, and how we expect the future to pan out. I mean, for us as a business, ultimately this is about serving our clients, and to do that, we need to take an informed view of the likely future state of the world based on what governments and regulators are saying in policy statements and what they're committing to in agreements. So if we unpack all that a little bit, first, let me speak a little bit about market trends, the expectations of clients and asset owners whose money we manage. So in asset management, institutional investors have experienced demand for ESG for some time, but that has really increased markedly recently. Interest in climate change within the ESG theme is particularly strong. Our research finds that inflows into global ESG funds during the COVID-19 crisis increased markedly, and that's also feeding through to 2020. We had a robust inflow of about 40% of total assets under management into ESG, compared to just 1.3% of inflows looking at all equity funds globally. And that trend is continuing, so there's a real emphasis on ESG. Our last major client survey found that investors now cite lower risks or improved returns as their main reason for focusing on ESG, as opposed to just it's the right thing to do. So this makes financial sense. And our own analysis bears that out. I mean, the performance of global companies with high ESG credentials suggests that sustainable investment themes lead to outperformance. And if you like, the quality of a firm's governance and general management tends to mirror a focus on ESG issues. So we've seen that European and US ESG equity indices have outperformed comparable non-ESG indices over the last 3 to 5 years. So that's the sort of trend in asset management. The second thing I'd like to turn to is net zero commitments. You'll be familiar with net zero. Most often talked about is to target consistent with a 1.5 degree temperature rise, to target net zero by 2050. And a lot of countries, regions, and firms are making such commitments. We are involved with something called the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which is under the auspices of the UN and Mark Carney. And that brings together around 160 firms responsible for over $70 trillion of assets. That initiative aims to accelerate the transition, net zero by 2050, and grounded in science through the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So that will be our guide to the progress we're making. Consistent with a net zero target by 2050, we also have to think about what that means for the pathway to get there. Where do we need to be in the interim decades as we go through? Now, we haven't quite answered that exam question yet, but what's clear is you can't just hope to backdate all of this and all do it between 2040 and 2050. So it may not be precisely linear, but for the sake of argument, let's just assume that it is broadly linear. That would mean for a bank like HSBC that we have to make significant inroads to the decarbonization of our portfolio and say be at around 33%, a third being counted as sustainable or transition aligned by 2030. And that's a huge job. I mean, as you will understand in many of your industries, making such a big change by 2030, that's tomorrow. So that's an important development around the net zero area. Third, I'd like to touch on regulatory expectations and obligations, the things that frame the way that we are obligated to perform. And the regulatory community, through its various bodies like NGFS and Basel and IOSCO, these are the standard setting bodies and regulatory cooperative bodies at the international level in finance, as well as individual letters, are beginning to make demands on industries to make it clear that they expect to see strategies and plans for the decarbonisation of our investment and lending portfolios. And they're beginning to introduce climate risk into the stress tests that they carry out of our institutions to see, are we ready for the move to net zero or the introduction of the Paris Agreement? Are we running excessive risk with regard to that, or are we in line? So we are responding to that by, of course, factoring climate-related risk into all our financial planning, our risk assessments, etc., and right through to our decision-making processes. I wanted just to talk fourth. I'll go to government actions. Now, obviously, there's the treaty itself, and the commitments that countries have made give the overall framework for what we expect. But aside from the COP treaty itself, we're also beginning to see climate issues become enshrined in other legally binding instruments. So bilateral trade agreements between governments, for example, will hold each government to certain commitments on the climate front. And in addition to that, we're also seeing the likes of the EU and the US saying that they will start using trade as an instrument in the climate area. So if a good is being sold in their country that has not been made to the same sort of environmental standards as holds in the region itself, then they will look to impose some sort of trade tariff to capture that difference. So we're beginning to see, not just in the COP, but in the broader policy landscape, a lot of thinking and a lot of instruments that are coming in that will have a big impact. And then finally, I wanted to touch on new standards that are driving the industry and also shaping the new products and services that we are providing to clients. One of our sort of industry bodies, ICMA, has produced a lot of principles that underpin the way that the industry is responding. And these cover green and sustainability bond principles, sustainability-linked bond principles, and these are mirrored too in the loan market. And the difference, if you like, is one thinks of a green bond or a sustainable bond as relating to activity that is very clearly green already, whereas a sustainability-linked bond or credit is linked more to the transition, to the changes that the issuer is making in order to make the transition to become sustainable. So these different products for slightly different situations. And along with that, we're doing a lot of work on disclosure, recording the data, the use of proceeds, etc., to make sure that we can't be accused of greenwashing, that the investments that we claim are sustainable are real. And we're putting a lot of effort into monitoring that and disclosing that to our shareholders and regulators and the broader community. So these principles and guidelines have underpinned innovation in financial institutions. We're seeing a big uptake in the use of these kind of products. And in addition to that and the client demand, we're also shaped, of course, by the wider societal expectations in terms of finance being part of the solution and not part of the problem. If I can, I'd just like to give you two examples of the sort of initiative we're involved in, practical things that we're doing in the economy. One is Fast Infra. This is a sustainable infrastructure initiative, and it involves HSBC and a number of other private players, but also some of the multilateral development banks. So we've got public and private sector together, and has the backing of a number of country ministries in various countries. And that's quite typical, actually, to begin to see real cooperation across public and private sectors. This infrastructure area, particularly in Asia, is absolutely key. I mean, the Asian Development Bank believes there's a $300 billion funding gap in Asia today, and that's excluding China. And one of the key obstacles for sustainable infrastructure development is not the lack of projects per se, but the lack of bankable projects that are given the right investment grade status by credit rating agencies that allows funds to flow to them. And currently, there's no real way for institutional investors to verify which assets are genuinely sustainable. So transforming sustainable infrastructure into a mainstream liquid asset would help investors make capital allocation choices that support the transition to a sustainable economy. This is an issue that is not just recognized by the financial sector and by project planners, but as I say, the MDBs, the World Bank, and countries, Japan in its G20, have been giving a big push to this. So what Fast Infra does, and we've done this alongside the IFC, part of the World Bank Group, the OECD, in others, is it brings together about 50 to 60 organizations in a collaboration to try and raise private investment in developing world sustainable infrastructure. And central to that is a globally applicable labeling system of investments, a sort of kite mark of sorts. So the standard underpinning this label will be a broader ESG criteria covering environmental, social, governance, and resilience. And the idea is that any host government or developer that wants to ensure that the infrastructure project they're involved in or designing, if they meet these ESG criteria set out as part of this initiative, then they know that they will be considered sustainable, and anyone considering and investing in their project will have confidence that they are sustainable. And we hope to be able to announce steps forward in this initiative ourselves coming up to the COP. Another project that was just announced last week in the same space, but I think is very, very topical, sees HSBC partnering with Temasek in Singapore and the ADB and others to produce a fund that will be managed independently. And we're seeding that with 150 million US to catalyze financing of marginally bankable infrastructure projects. So the key here is, there are a lot of projects that have risks associated with them for whatever reason. It could be political risk in the country concerned or other risks that the commercial world can't itself justify funding to its shareholders given the sort of risk return. But working with organizations like Temasek and combining our balance sheets and sharing that risk, then we can make things happen. And so this fund is a platform that will apply internationally recognized standards such as the Fast Infra kite mark that we've been talking about. It will target renewable energy, storage, water and waste treatment, as well as sustainable transport to help meet carbon reduction targets. And it will build in resilience to offset the impact of climate change. So taken together, these kind of initiatives are the things that we expect to have a profound and transformative impact on the finance industry, and it will be feeding through to the credit and business decisions that we take with regard to our funding of your sort of businesses in the real economy, and it will set the investment climate for the real economy. So coming on to that, just what do we expect to see? I'll get the right slide here. Excuse me. There we are. So transition in the real economy. I've mentioned that banks like HSBC have to reduce our exposure to carbon emitting activities over time. The flip side, it's not an entirely negative story, is that our appetite for supporting new technologies associated with the transition will increase. But there's clear implications for our clients there and the sort of credit we can supply and the investments that we'll be able to make. To reassure, we're not in the business of losing clients, but the challenge for us is to work with our clients to understand what the transition means for them and to discuss how we, as their financier, can get alongside them and help them finance their own transition strategies. However, for those firms that do not understand the seriousness of this situation and do not intend or feel the need to respond in any way at all, then frankly, they are likely to find themselves outside the risk appetite of international finance, certainly in the future. Now, our experience is that major international firms and large corporates are already thinking through their approach to transition, and particularly the timing and the uptake of new technologies. And as suppliers of finance, we're part of that discussion, particularly with those clients from the key emitting sectors like energy, transport, construction and agriculture. And science-based targets, as I mentioned before, under the UN auspices that are being developed for these sectors are likely to be the kind of metrics and guide to what a sensible transition in these sectors look like. And that is where finance will flow. For smaller and medium-sized firms, of course, it's a tougher issue. It might be tougher to realize immediately what the impacts are. And the budgets aren't necessarily there for massive investment. But one of the ways I think that this will trickle through to smaller firms is through supply chain management. So, at HSBC, we've been working with major clients such as Walmart and Puma as they set out to ensure that the firms that supply them meet the standards for sustainability that Walmart and Puma, in this case, are holding themselves to. And our role in the finance front is to ensure that there is cheaper finance for those firms, the better and more successful they are in ensuring that their supply chains too are sustainable. So there's a whole lot of incentives which come from these sort of market-based incentives and financial incentives, but also I think through regulation increasingly from governments in different areas that will force, I think, supply chains to shift over time. And obviously, the clearer the communication on that is, the better for everybody. So it might be slightly less clear for SMEs in terms of the size and form of the contribution they make to this transition at the moment. But I think you can expect the market to drive it, and you can expect, of course, governments to take practical initiatives on things like energy efficiency, building standards, etc. So looping back into finance again, I mean, my exam question for this talk was, to tell you about the impacts in business, and of course, finance is the business I know. So I'd like just to finish a little bit by talking about, what practically we're having to do as an organization to prepare ourselves for transition. One of the major challenges is to build capacity within our own staff. We have 250,000 staff worldwide, and we need to educate all of them to some degree at a basic level about how important this is for our industry and what we're doing about it. And then, of course, we need much more intense and bespoke training for those members of our firm who are client-facing frontline and need to be engaging in relatively sophisticated discussions with the clients that they serve. We also need to update our governance structures, and like most large firms, we have a board whose duty it is to ensure that the executive is running the firm well and prudently. And so there's many training exercises now produced for board members to educate them on the importance of this agenda and ensure that they are able to hold the executive to account in banks like HSBC. So exercises like that are well underway. We have a role to play also in helping the industry build capacity more widely. A good example of that is here in Hong Kong. We're working with the IFC and the Monetary Authority and discussing with them how a bank like us can help in their initiative to build capacity in the financial system throughout the Asian region. They have launched an initiative called the Alliance for Green Commercial Banks, and large international players like ourselves need to get alongside them in trying to knowledge share, present and ensure our understanding and what we're learning as we go through our transition journey is then passed on to more mid-sized players in the region. So we have that element to our preparation. We need to be transparent and disclose to our customers and shareholders on the progress we're making. To do that, we need reliable, high-quality data on the progress our clients are making, and it needs to be to internationally understood metrics. Many of these metrics will be produced to agreed standards. There's an international sustainability board that has just been set up on the accounting side that will be making clear what the standards in the climate area are that need to be reported on, and these are the standards that banks will work to. But as I say, our disclosure will only ever be as good as the information we can gather from our clients. And so we expect also that there will increasingly be legislation in most of the jurisdictions that we work in, obligating certainly major industries to keep data in accordance with these metrics that will be agreed internationally. We need also to embrace and drive new market developments. I've talked about some of the initiatives we're involved in. Carbon will increasingly be priced, I believe, but it's very difficult to do that uniformly. But the areas where we do expect to see some progress here is in the development of not just compliance carbon markets, like the ETS that works in Europe, where government controls the fixed number of permits, and then these are traded between emitting firms, but also voluntary carbon markets. And we've seen a lot of initiatives in the region, and I think Hong Kong has a real role to play here. I was talking to the head of the exchange, who's very keen to work in this area, and not just in Hong Kong, but also in the Greater Bay Area, to develop this sort of voluntary carbon offset market, where permits essentially come alongside the funding of the Earth's absorptive capacity to act as a carbon sink, or perhaps green renewable technologies, and you get credit for that can offset some of the emitting activity. But of course, the way that you use these, it can't just be a get out of jail free card. The use of such voluntary carbon credits really needs to be in the context of a clear net zero decarbonisation pathway. Otherwise, it will not really be judged credible by the broader market. But we're seeing a lot of activity in that area, and that's something that we're working on. But most importantly, as I mentioned before, what we need to do as the finance community is be part of the solution, not part of the problem, and that really is an opportunity for us. It's not just a moral imperative, though of course it is a moral imperative. It's also an opportunity to help firms with the investment they need to manage that transition. So, in conclusion, I hope I've convinced you that the impact on businesses like HSBC and the business community more generally is likely to be profound. I hope I've convinced you too that we're well appraised of that challenge and up to that challenge, and we're working hard to make sure that the necessary changes are made to our business. We're working with our clients, we're working with our policymakers to ensure that the transition can be effective and inclusive. It's an exciting time. We all need to respond as individuals and as corporations and as governments. And I've set out here in my closing slide some of the things that we need to make progress on in the very near future in order to give everybody the planning certainty that they need. We will only succeed if the private sector and the public sector work together, not just in the planning and the policy space, but also, as I showed in the example in Singapore, in the blending of balance sheets and the working together to take on the risks and ensure that private finance can flow to the firms and the communities that need it. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much for listening to me today. And I'm sorry again that I can't be with you for a more interactive Q&A session, but I know Felix intends to ask all the hard questions on your behalf.
Thank you, Stewart. Thank you. You give us a very good insight about all those kind of, what should we do in handling those kind of transition for the climate change. Yeah, I think a lot of companies in Hong Kong, they might focus on the climate change mitigation. Yeah, a lot of measure on it, but how about the transition? you have provided a lot of very good information about it. And some question. How do you see the action or awareness of the local Hong Kong company in addressing the risk posed by the climate change?
Well, I think Hong Kong, like everywhere, it's a mixed story. Different firms and different industries, depending on how directly and obviously they're impacted, are at different stages of thinking this through. I think the large firms in Hong Kong, those involved in energy and transport, etc., they're up to speed. They're thinking this through. They know the commitments that China has made in net zero by 2060, Hong Kong by 2050, reiterated again by Carrie Lam yesterday. And so they're thinking through about what that means for them and what they need to do to achieve that. I think obviously in the SME sector, planning is almost certainly a little bit further behind that. But again, I think the reinforcement of the seriousness with which the Hong Kong government takes this, as made clear in yesterday's chief executive address, will galvanize industry, trade bodies, etc., to be thinking about this and making sure that their members understand the need to be adapting, and that adaptation is not just a case of sort of mitigating risks. It's actually a business model transition, which will be forced, as I say, partly by government regulation, but also by market developments, supply chain requirements, etc., where they're feeding into larger firms. So I don't think there's not a burning platform in Hong Kong. I think the government's making the right noises, putting in the right sort of outreach to business to ensure that business is preparing. Some businesses are very well prepared. Some obviously have more progress to make.
Okay, thank you. In fact, a lot of audience are from the building and construction sector and also from environmental professionals. You have mentioned a lot about the transition approach that in finance. Would you have any advice if they are from the building and construction industry? What are the possible transactions they might consider if they are in the construction and building industry?
Yeah. So I don't claim to be an expert in this space, but some of the things that are going to frame, I think, the way they operate, partly they're very, very heavy electricity users, of course. And so beginning to think about where they source that electricity from is going to be important. In terms of their own manufacturing processes, I think there are, although I'm not familiar with all the details, I know there are technological advancements coming down the line that are going to help produce good quality construction materials with less environmental impact and less energy usage, and being, I think, clear about when these new technologies and industrial processes are mature and ready, to be adopted, I think is part of it. And then part of it is also in the end use, of course, in the industry, whether that be, making buildings, etc., where I think we will also see many more demands on efficiency, top-class insulation, smart buildings, and the way they work in order that they put less environmental demands in aggregate on communities and globally. So I think across these fronts there will be changes that they need to be on top of and thinking about, and I know that the biggest players almost certainly are.
One simple question. You have mentioned about the sustainable infrastructure. Say for example in Hong Kong, we have a lot of green building and also a lot of opportunity for retrofit of those kind of green building. Would this kind of structure can be classified as sustainable infrastructure that can be benefit from the finance side?
Yes, absolutely. And to the extent that these projects are made to the sort of standards that are consistent with the transition, or indeed are already considered, fully sustainable and green, they're much more likely to attract international finance than they would be otherwise. I mean, the danger is exactly the opposite, that old stock or indeed any new developments which, for whatever reason, chose not to adopt sustainable standards, they are likely to find it much more difficult to attract finance. At the very least, finance that flows in the future in accordance with the sort of international standards and rules of the road that are made in this area will not be able to deal with these.
Presentation, I see that about the phasing out of the combustion engineering vehicle, and I understand even in Hong Kong, government are planning to stop the import of the combustion engine vehicle, but maybe still have a long time. But would it mean that even in a coming near future, if I buy a combustion engineering vehicle, I can't get any financing?
So I think it's going to vary from country to country, depending on how ambitious and aggressive, if you like, the target is. I mean, the market tends to supply one way or another what is needed. So directionally, it's clear that you run a danger of not so much on the financing side, but finding fewer outlets to get petrol, as the infrastructure is put in for electric charging, etc. Of not getting parts because manufacturers are focused much more on their new stock and much less on their old stock. So there are a whole road of reasons directionally, where you in time would run a risk, if you like, by continuing to stick to a combustion engine. I don't want to sort of say that you couldn't ever get finance for the purchase of a combustion engine, but what I suspect would happen is that you would certainly get cheaper finance for the purchase of an electric vehicle, and it could well be. I mean, it's a question of timing actually and phasing, and certainly towards the end, you probably couldn't get finance, as we come towards the sort of net zero point. But exactly where that phasing comes and at what point finance gets cut off, I couldn't really predict. But what's clear, and I say this not particularly as an industry person, but just as someone who has a combustion engine in a 10-year-old car and will probably have to make a decision in the next few years about what car to buy next. And I think that's probably the moment where I have to sort of put my hand up and go electric, particularly given the job I do and the things I speak about. So you have to walk the walk.
I mean, could I say that, okay, in case of in future, if buying green product, we will get better finance instead of those non-green product?
I think that's very likely, yeah.
Okay, that's a good indicator for all of our company. That means when we decide something, go green, we will get better benefit in financing.
That is the trend. That is what my industry is trying to do and is doing in many cases. It's just a matter of timing, I think, before it becomes much more widespread.
When we talk about carbon neutrality, there will be a lot of requirement on carbon credit or carbon offset. And you have in your PowerPoint, you mentioned that the carbon pricing, must be credible and interoperable. Currently there's a lot of issue or problem for those kind of carbon credit?
So it's a really good question. I think one of the issues that has slightly dogged voluntary carbon offsets is a feeling that the standard is not always as high as it should be. In other words, it's not entirely dependable that the associated steps to increase the absorptive capacity of carbon are as effective as they ought to be for it to be a widely used and credible instrument. Now, there's a lot of work going on, which Mark Carney is in part leading in his UN envoy capacity, and that's about scaling up voluntary carbon offset markets. And what they are doing is they're setting out some sort of principles to guide standards that apply to how these carbon credits work, and these standards will talk to how effective the kind of carbon absorption or whatever needs to be, and also the independence of the body that will adjudicate and evaluate that. And by working on these things, then one, you can make the market credible. People, will trust that it's a valuable market. But the interoperable part also says that if different markets in different places are also working to that same standard, then you can almost trade between them, rather than there being an entirely fragmented approach. And one jurisdiction will recognize the credibility and the validity of a carbon credit that's perhaps produced somewhere else. So that's the point. There's going to be a lot of progress on this in the next year or so, and I think it's very important for this region. But I do come back to the other points. So as well as being credible in the terms that I've just spoken about, I think it also needs to be part of a decarbonisation strategy. In other words, you can't just say, I'd like to pollute, for the next 3 decades as much as possible, and I'm going to do that by buying as many carbon credits as I need to do it. I don't think that will work. I think you need to say, my decarbonisation strategy for my business is as follows, and as part of that strategy, I really need carbon credits at this stage in the journey. And then I think it will be credible, and I think regulators will put that kind of framework around it.
Yeah, that means at this moment we should go decarbonisation first. Yeah.
Well, you need to plan for decarbonisation and then use carbon credits potentially as part of that journey.
Okay, thank you, Stewart. Yeah, I think time is always up. Thank you for your time. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Felix.
Yes,
thank you, and good luck to everybody today.
Yeah, thank you.